the Supreme Court chamber fell into stunned silence. What had just happened was unprecedented in modern judicial history. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, one of the most powerful voices on the highest court in America, had just tried to cut off Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett mid-sentence during oral arguments. But what Jasmine fired back left everyone in that marble-column chamber absolutely speechless. The tension had been building for months, but nobody, not the seasoned justices, not the packed gallery, not even the veteran court reporters, expected what was about to unfold. In just 30 seconds, a rising Democratic star would challenge the very foundation of how the Supreme Court operates. And Justice Sotomayor's reaction would send shockwaves through Washington, D.C. The air in the chamber was electric with anticipation. Spectators who had arrived hours early to secure seats sensed they were about to witness something extraordinary. Legal scholars in the gallery exchanged nervous glances while veteran Supreme Court reporters prepared for what they suspected would be a career-defining moment to cover. The energy was different, charged with the kind of tension that only comes when powerful institutions are about to collide. Everyone could feel it. Something monumental was brewing. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation that's already breaking the internet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single moment of this political earthquake that has everyone talking. This story has everything: power, politics, and two brilliant women going head-to-head in the nation's highest court. What you're about to see will be analyzed and debated for years to come. This wasn't just a legal disagreement. This was a moment when two powerful women, each representing different generations of Democratic leadership, collided in the most public way possible. And what Jasmine Crockett said next would either make her career or end it forever. But here's what nobody saw coming: by the end of this confrontation, it wouldn't be Crockett's career on the line. At 70 years old, Justice Sonia Sotomayor commands the kind of respect that few people in America have earned. She's not just any Supreme Court justice. She's a trailblazer who shattered barriers and changed history. Born in a housing project in the South Bronx to Puerto Rican parents, her journey to the highest court in the land reads like the American dream itself. But don't let her inspiring backstory fool you. Sotomayor is absolutely brilliant, and she doesn't suffer fools gladly. From Princeton University to Yale Law School, where she served as editor of the Yale Law Journal, every step of her career has been marked by excellence and determination. She worked as a prosecutor, then a private attorney, then a federal judge, building the kind of resume that makes other lawyers feel inadequate. But it's not just her credentials that make her formidable, it's her personality. For over a decade, Sotomayor has been the liberal conscience of the court, writing fiery dissents on voting rights, immigration, and social justice that resonate far beyond legal circles. Her questioning style is legendary: sharp, direct, and unforgiving to lawyers who come unprepared. She asks the tough questions that other justices sometimes avoid, and she's not afraid to show her passion for justice and fairness. Throughout her career, she's maintained respect from across the political spectrum, even from conservatives who disagree with her philosophy. But today, she wasn't facing a nervous lawyer fumbling through legal briefs. Her opponent was cut from entirely different cloth. At 43, Jasmine Crockett represents everything the old political establishment both fears and admires: a new generation of leaders who refuse to play by the traditional rules. The Texas Congresswoman burst onto the national scene with fearless committee questioning and viral social media moments that made her one of the most followed members of Congress. But here's what makes her dangerous to the establishment. She's not just a politician with good sound bites. She's a former public defender and civil rights attorney who spent years in courtrooms fighting for clients who couldn't afford high-powered legal teams. This experience shaped her understanding of how the legal system actually affects ordinary Americans, knowledge that would prove absolutely crucial in today's confrontation. Representing Texas's 30th congressional district, including parts of Dallas, she's known for her sharp wit, her ability to cut through political nonsense, and her willingness to call out anyone when she believes they're wrong. Her trial lawyer background means she's completely comfortable with confrontation, and her social media savvy has made her a favorite among young progressive voters who see her as someone willing to fight the establishment. During her time in Congress, she's gained national attention for her performances in committee hearings, where she's grilled everyone from corporate executives to government officials with laser-focused questioning that often goes viral. But she's built her reputation on something more important than viral moments. She speaks truth to power, whether that power wears conservative suits or liberal robes. Henderson versus Texas wasn't just another case on the Supreme Court's docket. It was a potential earthquake that could reshape American democracy. This crucial voting rights case had the power to either protect the fundamental right to vote for millions of Americans or give states unprecedented authority to redraw district lines in ways that could systematically disenfranchise minority voters. The implications were staggering. Depending on how the court ruled, this case could either strengthen democratic participation or create a system where politicians choose their voters instead of voters choosing their politicians. As a member of the House Judiciary Committee, Crockett had been granted the extraordinarily rare privilege of presenting oral arguments alongside Department of Justice lawyers, a move that already had court traditionalists raising their eyebrows and whispering about precedent. Some legal experts called it a publicity stunt. Others argued it was a necessary evolution in how Congress and the court interact on constitutional issues. But everyone agreed on one thing: it was unprecedented, and unprecedented things in the Supreme Court usually create fireworks. For weeks leading up to this moment, the legal establishment had been buzzing with speculation about this unusual arrangement. Justice Sotomayor had been publicly skeptical in off-the-record conversations with legal journalists, expressing concerns about maintaining the court's dignity and traditional protocols. As someone who had worked her way up through the traditional legal hierarchy, she believed strongly that the court's authority came from respecting certain established procedures. Meanwhile, Crockett had been preparing for months, studying every voting rights case in American history, memorizing legal precedents, and practicing with constitutional law professors who understood the enormous pressure she would face. She knew she was entering hostile territory, not just from conservative justices who disagreed with her politics, but potentially from liberal justices who might view her as an outsider disrupting their carefully maintained institutional norms. The stage was perfectly set for an epic clash between institutional tradition and generational change, between the old ways of doing things and new demands for democratic accountability. But what nobody expected was how intensely personal this confrontation would become, or how it would force both women to confront fundamental questions about power, respect, and what it really means to serve the American people. When the day finally arrived, the Supreme Court chamber buzzed with an energy that veteran court watchers hadn't felt in decades. The marble columns seemed to stand at attention, and even journalists who had covered thousands of oral arguments could sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. Justice Sotomayor took her seat on the bench with her usual composed demeanor, but those who knew her well could detect a slight tension in her posture, the kind that suggested she was prepared for battle. "Your Honors," Congresswoman Crockett began as she stood at the podium, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had spent years in courtrooms fighting for justice. "I stand before you not just as a member of Congress, but as someone who has witnessed firsthand how the issues in this case affect real people in real communities." The words hung in the air with unexpected power. This wasn't the nervous energy of a typical Supreme Court argument. This was something entirely different. Justice Clarence Thomas, who famously rarely asks questions during oral arguments, actually leaned forward slightly in his chair. Justice Samuel Alito's pen stopped moving across his notepad. Even Justice Amy Coney Barrett, usually focused intently on her notes, looked up with obvious interest. But it was Justice Sotomayor whose reaction was most telling. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and her fingers drummed once against the bench, a subtle sign that those familiar with her body language knew indicated disagreement. The battle lines were already being drawn, and everyone in the chamber could feel the electricity building. From her very first words, Crockett had made it clear that this would not be a typical legal argument focused solely on abstract constitutional principles. As Crockett laid out her argument about the Constitution's requirements for fair representation, the questions from the justices started coming fast and sharp, like artillery fire from an entrenched position. Justice Brett Kavanaugh challenged her interpretation of legal precedent with the kind of aggressive questioning that usually rattles inexperienced advocates. Justice Neil Gorsuch questioned her understanding of federalism principles, probing for weaknesses in her constitutional analysis. But Crockett held her ground like a seasoned trial lawyer, firing back with case citations and constitutional analysis that impressed even her harshest critics. This wasn't a politician playing lawyer for the cameras. This was a skilled attorney who happened to hold elected office, and she was demonstrating legal knowledge that rivaled any Supreme Court advocate. Then Justice Alito delivered what everyone expected to be the knockout punch. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said with a slight edge to his voice that suggested he was setting a trap, "are you arguing that this court should essentially rewrite decades of precedent based on your political preferences?" The gallery held its collective breath. This was exactly the kind of loaded question designed to derail an argument and expose an advocate's weaknesses. Crockett paused for just a moment, but instead of showing nervousness, she smiled. "Justice Alito, with respect," she replied with calm confidence, "I'm not asking you to rewrite precedent. I'm asking you to apply it correctly. And nothing about equal representation under the law should be considered a political preference." A few people in the gallery actually gasped at the directness of her response. Lawyers simply didn't speak to Supreme Court justices that way. But Crockett was just getting started. As her argument time continued, Crockett began weaving in examples from her own district, powerful stories of voters who had been disenfranchised, communities that had been split apart by gerrymandering, and the real-world consequences of the court's previous decisions. "Your Honors," she said, her voice rising with genuine passion, "this isn't an abstract legal exercise. Every time this court weakens voting protections, real people lose their voice in democracy. In my district alone, that's when Justice Sotomayor struck like lightning." "Congresswoman Crockett," Sotomayor interrupted, her voice cutting through the chamber like a blade, "this court is not a political forum. We deal with law, not anecdotes." The chamber went completely silent. Even the court stenographer looked up from her machine in shock. Sotomayor continued, her tone growing more stern with each word. "Your role here is to present legal arguments based on constitutional interpretation and precedent. Personal stories and political advocacy have no place in these proceedings." The rebuke hung in the air like a thunderclap that left everyone's ears ringing. Veteran Supreme Court reporters later said they had never witnessed anything quite like it. One of the court's most liberal justices publicly dressing down someone arguing for a liberal position. It was unprecedented, shocking, and absolutely brutal. Crockett stood at the podium, and for a split second it seemed like she might wilt under the public correction from one of the most respected jurists in America. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, with every person in the chamber holding their breath to see how she would respond. Then Crockett did something that stunned everyone present. She smiled. Not a nervous smile or a deferential smile, but the confident smile of someone who had just been handed exactly the opening she needed. "Justice Sotomayor," Crockett said, her voice calm but carrying clearly throughout the chamber, "with the greatest respect for this court and your distinguished service, I have to disagree." The collective intake of breath from the gallery was audible. Had a sitting congresswoman just told a Supreme Court justice she was wrong? Crockett stepped slightly closer to the podium, her posture straightening as she prepared to deliver what would become one of the most quoted exchanges in Supreme Court history. "You said personal stories have no place here," she continued with growing confidence. "But wasn't it personal stories that shaped this court's greatest decisions? Wasn't it the personal story of Linda Brown that led to Brown versus Board of Education? Wasn't it the personal story of Clarence Gideon that established the right to counsel?" Justice Sotomayor's face had become unreadable, but observers noticed her knuckles were white as she gripped her pen. Crockett pressed forward like a trial lawyer who sensed her opponent's weakness. "Justice Sotomayor, your own confirmation hearings were filled with personal stories about your diabetes, about your mother's strength, about how your personal experiences would inform your judicial philosophy. Were those stories irrelevant to your fitness for this court?" The chamber was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. Even Chief Justice John Roberts, usually quick to maintain order and prevent arguments from spiraling out of control, seemed frozen by the unprecedented nature of what was unfolding before his eyes. But Crockett wasn't finished delivering her constitutional lesson. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice now carrying the full authority of her position as an elected representative of the American people, "I would respectfully remind this court that I'm not just a lawyer arguing a case. I'm a member of Congress representing 760,000 Americans who sent me here to speak for them." She gestured toward the gallery where several of her constituents sat watching this historic exchange unfold. Those people don't have law degrees from Yale or Princeton. They can't cite constitutional precedents from memory. But they know when their rights are being violated, and they elected me to be their voice even in this chamber. Justice Sotomayor leaned forward, clearly preparing to respond to this direct challenge to the court's authority. But Crockett held up a respectful but firm hand, signaling she wasn't done. Your Honor, if this court believes that the lived experiences of American citizens are irrelevant to constitutional interpretation, then perhaps it's time to ask whether this court is still connected to the people it serves. The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't yet exploded. A sitting congresswoman had just questioned the Supreme Court's connection to the American people to Justice Sotomayor's face, in front of the entire legal establishment. Chief Justice Roberts finally found his voice. Congresswoman Crockett, please confine your remarks to the legal issues before the court. But the damage was done. In less than 2 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had turned a judicial rebuke into a fundamental challenge to how the Supreme Court operates, and Justice Sotomayor looked like she had just been intellectually slapped. What happened next would be analyzed and debated in law schools and political science classes for decades to come. Justice Sotomayor, one of the most experienced and formidable jurists on the court, found herself in a position she had never faced before, being publicly challenged not just on legal interpretation, but on the fundamental philosophy of how judges should make decisions. The justice leaned back in her chair, her dark eyes studying Crockett with an intensity that made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of judicial authority. Congresswoman Crockett, Sotomayor said slowly and deliberately, "Are you suggesting that this court's commitment to constitutional law should be subordinated to popular sentiment?" It was a masterfully crafted question designed to force Crockett into an impossible position. Say yes, and she would be advocating for mob rule over constitutional principles. Say no, and she would have to back down from her previous statements. But Crockett had spent her entire career handling loaded questions from hostile judges and opposing attorneys who underestimated her. And she was absolutely ready for this moment. Justice Sotomayor, Crockett replied, her voice steady and clear, "I'm suggesting that constitutional law that ignores the real-world impact on American citizens isn't constitutional law at all. It's academic theory divorced from reality." The response was so direct and unexpected that Justice Thomas actually looked up from his notes for the first time in the entire session. Crockett continued with the confidence of someone who had found her rhythm. "This court has the power to interpret the Constitution, but the Constitution belongs to the people. When this court makes decisions that systematically exclude certain voices from democracy, it's not protecting the Constitution, it's undermining it." She gestured toward the portrait of Chief Justice John Marshall that hung prominently in the chamber, invoking the very foundations of American judicial authority. John Marshall established judicial review not to create an unaccountable aristocracy of legal scholars, but to ensure that the Constitution remained a living document that protected all Americans, not just those with the education and resources to navigate complex legal systems. Justice Sotomayor's face flushed slightly, whether from anger or embarrassment. Observers couldn't tell. But Crockett wasn't done with her constitutional history lesson. "Your Honor, you've written eloquently about how your background as a Latina from the Bronx informs your judicial perspective. You've argued that diversity of experience strengthens this court's decision-making. I agree completely." The compliment seemed to catch Sotomayor off guard, and for a moment, her stern expression softened slightly. "But if personal experience matters for justices," Crockett continued, building to her rhetorical climax, "why doesn't it matter for the people whose lives are affected by your decisions? Why is your story relevant but theirs isn't?" It was a masterstroke of legal argumentation, using Sotomayor's own judicial philosophy against her current position, and doing it with respect but devastating effectiveness. "Your Honor, I want to read you something," Crockett said, pulling out a small card from her jacket pocket with theatrical precision. "This is the oath I took when I was sworn into Congress. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." She looked directly at Sotomayor with unwavering eye contact. "That same Constitution that gives you the power to interpret law gives me the power and the responsibility to speak for my constituents. When you tell me that their stories don't matter in constitutional interpretation, you're not just silencing me, you're silencing them. The chamber was electric with tension that seemed to crackle through the air. This had moved far beyond a typical legal argument into fundamental questions about democracy, representation, and the proper role of judicial power in American government. Justice Kavanaugh attempted to intervene and redirect the conversation. "Congresswoman, perhaps we could return to the specific legal issues in the case." But Crockett turned toward him with the same unwavering confidence she had shown throughout this remarkable exchange. "Justice Kavanaugh, the legal issue is whether American citizens have an equal voice in democracy. The constitutional issue is whether this court will protect that voice or systematically weaken it. And the human issue, which I would argue is inseparable from the legal and constitutional issues, is whether the people in my district will have the same political power as people in more privileged districts." Justice Sotomayor had been silent during this latest exchange, but now she leaned forward again with obvious curiosity. When she spoke, her voice had lost some of its earlier authority and carried a note of genuine interest rather than confrontation. "Congresswoman Crockett, what exactly are you asking this court to do?" It was the opening Crockett had been waiting for, the moment when she could shift from defense to offense, from responding to accusations to making her affirmative case for constitutional democracy. "Justice Sotomayor, I'm asking this court to remember that every constitutional principle exists to serve real people living real lives. I'm asking you to consider that when you weaken voting protections, you're not just changing legal precedent, you're changing who gets to participate in American democracy." She moved closer to the podium, her voice growing stronger and more passionate with each word. "I'm asking this court to recognize that equal protection under the law isn't an abstract legal concept. It's a daily reality for millions of Americans who are counting on you to protect their fundamental rights." Then Crockett did something that would be replayed on news channels and social media for weeks to come. She looked directly at Justice Sotomayor and spoke not as a lawyer to a judge, but as one woman to another who had broken barriers and changed history. "Justice Sotomayor, you spent your career breaking barriers and opening doors that had been closed to people like us. You've shown that excellence comes in many forms and that diversity strengthens institutions rather than weakening them. You've proven that someone from the Bronx can sit on the highest court in the land and make it better, not just different." The justice's expression had completely changed now, the stern authority replaced by something more human and complicated. "All I'm asking," Crockett continued with genuine emotion in her voice, "is that you apply that same principle to the people whose cases come before you. They may not have law degrees, but they have wisdom born from experience. They may not be able to cite legal precedents, but they understand justice in ways that textbooks can't teach. And they deserve to have their voices heard, not just in elections, but in the courtrooms where their fates are decided." Justice Sotomayor sat quietly for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the challenge Crockett had presented so eloquently. The entire chamber waited in suspense to see how one of the court's most formidable intellects would respond to being so directly and respectfully confronted about the foundations of her judicial philosophy. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than it had been all morning, carrying a tone of reflection rather than confrontation. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said with obvious thoughtfulness, "you've given this court much to consider. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't a dismissal either. It was something no one in that chamber had ever heard before, a Supreme Court justice acknowledging that she might have been wrong, that she had something to learn from the challenge presented by an elected representative of the people." Justice Sotomayor continued, "Perhaps the question isn't whether personal stories belong in constitutional interpretation, but how we balance individual experiences with legal principles." The admission sent immediate shockwaves through the legal community watching this exchange unfold. But Crockett wasn't content with a partial victory or diplomatic language that might obscure the fundamental issues at stake. "Justice Sotomayor," she said with continued respect but unwavering directness, "that balance isn't something you achieve by excluding voices. It's something you achieve by including more of them." And then she delivered the line that would define this entire historic exchange and be quoted in constitutional law textbooks for generations. "This court's legitimacy doesn't come from being removed from the people. It comes from serving them. And you can't serve people you refuse to hear." The silence that followed was absolutely deafening, as if the entire weight of American constitutional democracy was hanging in the balance. Justice Sotomayor stared at Crockett for what felt like an eternity, her expression cycling through surprise, consideration, and finally something that looked remarkably like respect. Then, slowly and deliberately, she nodded. "Point taken, Congresswoman. Please continue with your argument." It was a complete reversal that stunned everyone present. In the span of 10 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had transformed a humiliating judicial rebuke into a profound teaching moment about democracy and representation, and one of the most powerful women in America had just acknowledged that she had learned something important. As Congresswoman Crockett concluded her remaining arguments and left the podium, the Supreme Court chamber buzzed with an energy that nobody present had ever experienced in that hallowed space. Legal reporters were already crafting breaking news alerts on their phones, knowing they had just witnessed something that would be studied and analyzed for decades. Law professors were frantically texting their colleagues to make sure they had watched the live stream. Spectators in the gallery sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what they had just observed, a fundamental challenge to judicial authority that had somehow strengthened rather than weakened the institution. Justice Sotomayor remained on the bench for the remainder of the session, but observers noted that her entire demeanor had shifted dramatically. Where she had begun the day with stern institutional authority, she now asked questions with genuine curiosity and engaged with subsequent speakers with noticeable respect for their perspectives and experiences. When Chief Justice Roberts finally gavelled the session to a close, the usual orderly exit from the chamber became something closer to controlled chaos as reporters rushed to file their stories and legal experts huddled in animated discussions about the unprecedented exchange they had just witnessed. Within minutes of the session ending, #Crockett versus Sotomayor was trending nationwide on every social media platform. Legal Twitter exploded with analysis from constitutional scholars, practicing attorneys, and political commentators trying to make sense of what had just happened. Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe, one of the most respected constitutional scholars in America, tweeted, "In 40 years of watching the Supreme Court, I've never seen anything like Jasmine Crockett challenging Justice Sotomayor on judicial philosophy. Brilliant, necessary, and historically significant." Conservative legal commentator Jonathan Turley offered grudging respect. "While I disagree with Representative Crockett's politics, her performance today was masterful advocacy that any Supreme Court lawyer would envy." The Supreme Court's official YouTube channel, which typically garnered modest viewership for oral arguments, saw the Crockett exchange rack up over 2 million views in just 24 hours. Comments poured in from viewers who had never watched court proceedings before, many expressing amazement that such direct challenges were even possible in the formal setting of the nation's highest court. Progressive Democrats immediately hailed Crockett as a hero for democratic representation. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "This is what fearless representation looks like." Jasmine Crockett spoke for millions of Americans who are rarely heard in those marble halls. House Speaker Mike Johnson, despite disagreeing with Crockett's political positions, offered measured praise. "While I disagree with Congresswoman Crockett's stance on this case, I respect her willingness to challenge the judiciary directly. That takes genuine courage." House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries called it a masterclass in constitutional advocacy and democratic representation, praising both women for demonstrating how disagreement could be both respectful and transformative. Law schools across the country began immediately incorporating the exchange into their constitutional law curricula, with professors using it to teach students about the relationship between democratic representation and judicial authority. The National Bar Association issued a statement praising both women for demonstrating that respectful disagreement between powerful individuals could elevate rather than diminish important constitutional discussions. 3 days after the confrontation, Justice Sotomayor spoke at a judicial conference in Chicago and offered her most extensive public comments about the exchange. Recently, she told the audience of federal judges, "I was reminded that our role as judges isn't to stand apart from the American people we serve, but to remain connected to them. That service requires not just legal expertise, but intellectual humility about the limits of our own perspectives." The comments signaled a remarkable willingness by a sitting Supreme Court justice to acknowledge that she had been influenced and changed by criticism from a member of Congress. Legal scholars immediately began debating whether the exchange represented a new model for how elected officials should interact with the federal judiciary, balancing respect for judicial independence with democratic accountability. Professor Lamar wrote in The Atlantic, Representative Crockett treated the Supreme Court as a co-equal branch of government rather than an untouchable authority figure. That approach is actually more consistent with the Constitution's original design than the excessive deference we've come to expect. The national conversation sparked by this 10-minute exchange went far beyond legal circles, touching on fundamental questions about the court's role in American democracy, the appropriate level of deference citizens should show to judicial authority, and whether the Supreme Court had become too insulated from the people it serves. Law schools reported significant increases in applications, with many prospective students citing Crockett's performance as inspiration for legal careers focused on civil rights and democratic representation. Several members of Congress announced plans to pursue additional legal education to better engage with constitutional issues. Most significantly, the Supreme Court itself began implementing changes designed to make oral arguments more accessible to ordinary Americans, including enhanced live streaming capabilities and simplified explanations of legal proceedings for public consumption. For Jasmine Crockett personally, the confrontation transformed her from a rising political star into a truly national figure with influence far beyond her Texas congressional district. Her office received over 50,000 emails from supporters in all 50 states, and speaking requests poured in from law schools, civil rights organizations, and political groups across the country. I've heard from high school teachers showing the video to their civics classes, young lawyers inspired to take on challenging cases they might have avoided before, and ordinary citizens who felt like someone was finally speaking for them in the halls of power, Crockett said in a CNN interview days after the exchange. But perhaps most surprisingly, Justice Sotomayor and Congresswoman Crockett developed what sources described as a respectful professional relationship in the weeks following their confrontation. 3 weeks later, they had an hour-long private conversation at a legal conference, during which a source reported that Sotomayor told Crockett, "You challenged me to be better at my job. That's exactly what public servants should do for each other." Legal historians have already begun placing this exchange alongside other watershed moments in Supreme Court history that fundamentally changed how Americans think about judicial power and democratic representation. Professor Randy Barnett of Georgetown Law wrote, Representative Crockett reminded the court that its legitimacy ultimately depends on the consent of the governed. That's not a challenge to judicial independence, it's a defense of constitutional democracy itself. The confrontation opened conversations about the Supreme Court's proper role in American democracy that would continue long after the specific case was decided. Justice Sotomayor seemed genuinely energized by the challenge, asking more probing questions about real-world impacts in subsequent oral arguments. Meanwhile, Crockett used her elevated platform to advocate for greater civic education and more meaningful engagement between elected officials and the federal judiciary. But this confrontation represented something much more significant than just dramatic Supreme Court theater or political theater. It symbolized a fundamental shift in how Americans think about judicial authority, democratic representation, and the proper relationship between legal expertise and popular sovereignty. By refusing to be silenced or intimidated by institutional authority, Crockett demonstrated that genuine respect for democratic institutions doesn't require unquestioning deference to them. By acknowledging the validity of Crockett's challenge and showing willingness to reconsider her own assumptions, Justice Sotomayor proved that true judicial wisdom includes the humility to learn from criticism, even when it comes from outside traditional legal circles. Together, these two remarkable women modeled the kind of democratic engagement that was both deeply respectful and intellectually rigorous, exactly what American democracy needs in an era of polarization and declining trust in institutions. In an era when many Americans have lost faith in their democratic institutions, this exchange offered a powerful glimpse of how public officials might disagree productively while actually strengthening the institutions they serve rather than tearing them down. The impact of those 10 extraordinary minutes would reverberate through American law and politics for years to come, serving as a reminder that in a healthy democracy, no institution, no matter how powerful or prestigious, should be beyond respectful but firm challenge from the people it serves. What do you think about this unprecedented confrontation that's still making waves across America? Did Jasmine Crockett go too far in challenging Justice Sotomayor's authority? Or did she do exactly what elected representatives should do when they believe judicial power is being misused for the wrong purposes? This debate has divided legal experts, political commentators, and ordinary Americans who watched this remarkable exchange unfold in real time. Some argue that Crockett showed fundamental disrespect for judicial authority and the institutional dignity that the Supreme Court requires to function effectively. Others believe she demonstrated exactly the kind of democratic accountability that the Founding Fathers intended when they created our careful system of checks and balances between co-equal branches of government. This moment raises fundamental questions that go to the heart of how American democracy should actually work in practice. Should elected officials always defer to judicial authority, even when they believe that authority is being exercised in ways that harm the people they represent? Or should they challenge it directly and publicly, as Crockett did with such remarkable effect? The answer to these questions may well determine how American democracy evolves and adapts in the coming years, as new generations of leaders confront old assumptions about power, authority, and democratic representation. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We genuinely want to hear your perspective on this historic confrontation. And if you found this story as compelling and important as we did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our coverage of the biggest political moments as they happen. Because if this extraordinary exchange taught us anything, it's that in American democracy, the most important conversations often happen when powerful people are willing to challenge each other respectfully but fearlessly. And that's a conversation we all need to be part of as engaged citizens in a democratic society.